Okay, now that we have, we're kind of concluding um, the high holy days, and especially as we are concluding with Sukkot, I thought it's only natural to look at the story of one man in the Bible, and I'm speaking, of course, of Moshe. What I like to do, I wish sometimes I were more of a biblical scholar, as many of you are here. And so, what I usually do when I read through the scripture and the stories in the Bible is try to figure out what kind of application it would have for us. So, I'm going to try to do that tonight. My initial thought was focusing on the life of Moses, was to say, uh, think about him in three different ways. First of all, Moses the man, Moses the leader, and Moses the man of God. And then I thought, no, that's not necessary, because everything he did was because he was a man of God. Uh, Starting, of course, even with the time he was born, when all male Hebrew babies were born, they had to be put to death. We know how it was God's plan that he would survive. And we all know the story of how his mother um, floated him down the river where she knew Pharaoh's daughter would be bathing, and then had his sister Miriam follow along the riverbank and told Pharaoh's daughter that she knew a Hebrew woman who would nurse the baby. And I always have to laugh at the fact that, can you imagine how it is for Moses's mother here? Here she gets to nurse him, be with him, and gets paid to do it. I saw a cartoon one time of Pharaoh's daughter holding Moses in her arms, standing before Pharaoh on the throne. And he's saying to her, "Okay, daughter, you may keep this baby. After all, I can't imagine that it would be harmful if just one Hebrew male child survived." So we all have to laugh about that too, don't we? But we knew that it was God's plan all along. And we also know that Moses led a very pleasant and charmed life in Israel in Egypt, until he had to flee after killing an Egyptian who was striking a Hebrew. And he killed the Egyptian and then was confronted the next day by a couple of Hebrews who felt like maybe he might kill them too. So he had to leave Egypt. So later, when God called Moses to lead his people out of Egypt, Moses did what many of us do. He used the excuse that he was slow of speech. And God said, "No worries, I'll send your brother Aaron along with you to help you." And of course, God also allowed Moses to perform miracles, such as his staff turning into the snake, and plagues to show that he was under God's authority. But I always have to wonder there, I have never seen this anywhere, but you have to wonder, was Moses maybe partly, I know he used the excuse that I'm slow of speech, but you have to wonder if maybe he was a little nervous about going back to Egypt, where he had left under such bad circumstances. And of course, we all marvel at Moses as leading the Israelites through the desert for 40 years, a trip that could have been made in 11 days if they had been prepared to enter the promised land, which they were not. But it was in this journey, which is kind of interesting, that Moses, although a great leader, was understandably angry at many times with all the grumbling and complaining. And of course, sometimes we can understand how that would happen too. But during this journey, Moses, who had proclaimed that he was slow of speech, gave some inspiring talks to those who were preparing to enter the land of Canaan. He reviewed the law and gave history to those who were so young that they didn't remember too much of the former life. He told them to love God completely, and he told parents to always teach their children about God's miracles and faithfulness. He was called Israel's greatest prophet, And he was one of the only, I think he was about the only person who ever talked face to face with God. And yet, because of his active disobedience, when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, we know that he was not allowed to enter into the promised land with all the others. It must have been hard for God to do that, knowing that he had been faithful as long as he had been. But then God does keep his word. I was thinking, if you think about it, it's difficult for us as parents today to allow our children to suffer consequences. So it's almost understandable that God might have been. I think he at the end when he said, Moses, you can look into the promised land. I don't know if any of you have seen the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston standing there looking over to Canaan, but it's a very, very powerful scene. So then we have to say, okay, how does the life of Moses apply to our lives today? I think mostly it kind of reminds us that we all have flaws, but that doesn't mean we cannot be used for God's intended purpose in our lives. One of my favorite stories to illustrate this is called The Cracked Pot. This is the story of the cracked pot. There was once a water carrier who traveled each day to a river with 2 pots on a pole across her shoulder. Both pots were the same size and shape, but one had a crack in it, so it was a cracked pot. And it returned to the house only half full. The pot was very ashamed of its flaws, but the water carrier did not replace it over the years. Finally, the pot got up the nerve to ask the water carrier why this was the case. The water carrier replied that the cracked pot served a great purpose. She had planted wildflower seeds on the side where the cracked pot would travel back to the house, and the pot watered the plants. She explained that the beauty of seeing the flowers brightened up her life. So in our lives, we are all somewhat cracked pots. We all have our flaws, but this doesn't mean that because we're not perfect, we can't serve a good purpose. If we allow ourselves to dwell on our imperfections rather than on our abilities, then we can never perform the mission that God had intended us to do in this life. Moses told God he was slow of speech. Paul in 2 Corinthians said he asked God 3 times to remove the thorn from his flesh, but God said, no, my grace is sufficient, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. If we were all perfect, we would not rely on the strength of God. Only through his grace and strength are we allowed to work for his glory as we serve him. Shabbat Shalom.